What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you a video about what Larian is doing to change turn-based combat. Now, if you've never watched one of my videos before, I review a lot of games, and with those reviews, I have a bit of a specialty, and that is CRPGs, especially isometric CRPGs. I've played and reviewed a great many of them, and with that comes a wealth of experience when it comes to their combat systems. And while the footage you're most likely to see in this video is primarily going to be from Baldur's Gate 3, what we're talking about today is the broader implications of the systems Larian has been adding into Baldur's Gate 3 and what it's doing for turn-based combat. Because while I do think Baldur's Gate 3 is going to be a great game and I'm excited for it overall, I think probably the most important thing that they're doing is these smaller changes that affect the entire genre, or at least have the potential to. Now, if you're completely unaware and you just know that you like Baldur's Gate and you want to play Baldur's Gate 3 because it's a big game, then we'll start at the beginning. These type of games, CRPGs, basically have one of two combat systems 90% of the time, and that is either turn-based, like Baldur's Gate 3, or real-time with pause. Now, each of them have their pros and cons. Personally, I tend to lean more turn-based. That tends to be my preference, but obviously with reviewing all these games, I'm very comfortable with both. Now, real-time with pause, which won't really be the subject of this video as much, is faster and more action-packed, frankly. However, the big con of this system is that you tend to not have as much granular control over what each individual character is doing. Or in order to have that level of control, you basically have to pause the game so often that it might as well be turn-based, or in more recent times with the addition of things like AI editors, or at least very in-depth AI editors, I should say. Some older games had AI editors as well, but with the more recent nuanced ones like you see in Pillars of Eternity 2, you then script that AI to the point where you're just not even playing that character anyway. So the other option, turn-based, gives us much more tactical control over what we're doing. However, the big and loudest complaint you'll hear about turn-based is that it is very slow, which is true. It absolutely is. I've reviewed many of these games and it is unquestionably quite slow. Now, up to this point, a few attempts have been made here and there to kind of change the flow of this. For instance, there tends to be the team-based approach where your entire team will get to take their turn and then the enemy team will take their turn. Now, that is the approach I have generally preferred when it comes to trying to speed things up, but I would tell you that when you're fighting a lot of enemies, this is actually also an issue because the enemy turn can unironically take a few minutes sometimes, as each individual character has to take their turn. Another approach to turn-based that attempts to keep you more in the action as well is the system that Divinity Original Sin 2 used, where the enemy team and your team would actually all roll initiative, and then the game would rotate between the enemy team and your team. So you might go, the enemy might go, whoever rolled higher, and then the opposite team would go. So say you went first, you go first, then the enemy with the next highest initiative goes first, and then your next character with the higher initiative goes first, and then back and forth and back and forth. However, this runs into the problem that there are fights where you are simply outnumbered, and we run into the same problem. We have to wait for all those characters to take their turn. And that is probably where the changes that Larian is making with Baldur's Gate 3 are the most interesting to me. Because what Larian Studios is attempting to do in Baldur's Gate 3 is approach this and address some of the slowness attributed to turn-based combat. Now, I do think that there is still work to be done even with the changes that they have implemented, but they have taken more steps towards speeding this up than I've seen any developer do in a long time, so I wanted to talk about that today. But before we jump into it, one more quick note is that some games do have the option of doing both. However, outside of Pathfinder Wrath of the Righteous, you actually have to choose one or the other before the game actually starts with, like, say, Pillars of Eternity 2. Pathfinder Wrath of the Righteous actually also did something really cool where you could just straight up toggle between each one in real time in the middle of combat. It didn't matter. You just hit the button and it toggled back and forth. Also a fantastic option. I love that. And ideally, you would toggle that particular system with what Larian's doing, and I think you would have an amazing experience. But at the end of the day, it's a lot of work tailoring and balancing these fights around one system, let alone two, so I get the general avoidance of trying to do both. But I thought that was worth a mention. Now, let's actually jump into some of the stuff Larian is doing. So for starters, in an interview when Baldur's Gate 3 released into early access, quite a while ago now, to be honest, Sven, the CEO of Larian, talked about some of the things they they were doing just to tighten up turn-based on the back end, which ultimately is going to result in very minor changes that hurry things up, such as getting the animations exactly right to when the turn actually shifts. Behind the scenes stuff that you wouldn't actually see that actually just pushes the turns quicker and quicker, so you can shave off like a second here and a second there, which is minor, but it adds up over the course of turn-based and results in the game just quickly snapping between turn after turn as quickly as it can. Now, the next thing that they've done to Baldur's Gate 3 is letting characters in the turn order take their turns together. So if your characters go one after the other in the turn order with whoever rolled initiative, then you can actually take the turn of each of those characters in whatever order you please. Now, this does a couple things. One, it lets you just move all of these guys very quickly, and it all kind of counts as one turn, if you will. So you don't, again, have to wait for that cycle of the game to switch turn to turn. Also, it actually gives you access to more tactical options. For instance, if a character that goes later can do something that then sets up an earlier character's turn order to deal a combo of some sort or exploit a buff that the other character is able to provide, you can then just switch between characters and take advantage of that, which is going to maximize your damage efficiency or just your efficiency in general and speed up combat simply because you're able to set up things that you want to do much quicker. On top of the fact that it keeps you more in the action, because again, you're not having to cycle between turns, you just have to pick one character or the other, and it all kind of counts as one turn. And then we have probably the biggest change of all, and the one I'm most excited about, hence why I saved it for last. And that is the recently announced at their panel from hell, Swarm AI. Swarm AI effectively allows minor units who are essentially the same to all act together. And I would tell you this change is going to shave minutes, if not tens of minutes in some cases, off of turn-based combat. In BG3, say you're fighting a bunch of goblins, well, now instead of having to wait for like 10 goblins to each take their turn individually, they can all take their turn at exactly the same time. Now, this AI is only going to be present in some fights, obviously, where we have a lot of the same type of small enemy, so it's not necessarily applicable to every situation. But in turn-based, especially in fights where you are overwhelmed by minor enemies, you will no longer have to wait for them each to take their turn one after the other very slowly, which sounds like a small thing, but I assure you for this type of game that is a huge improvement to have all of those characters taking their turns at the same time. As off the top of my head, I could point to a dozen fights across a dozen games where that is an issue. The defense of the tavern in the first act of Pathfinder Wrath of the Righteous, for instance, comes to mind, which is a fight that unironically takes hours in turn-based, or at least it can, largely due to the sheer amount of enemies that have to take their turn. So all of that said, guys, while it might not be the most exciting topic in the world, I am, on a personal level, as someone who loves this genre and is a deep-seated nerd, I love reading about this stuff. I actually think that Swarm AI is probably the individually coolest thing that they showed at that panel from hell, and I am very excited to see if other studios and other games can make use of it and manage to replicate it to make the entire genre, especially turn-based, much more approachable and fun for people. But I would say I don't want the work to stop here. The quicker and snappier you can get turn-based, the better it is for everyone, because that cuts down from the biggest problem there is with turn-based, and that is, of course, that it is painfully slow sometimes. But I think with people like Larian and the very talented people that work there on the issue, we might soon, in the next few years, potentially be seeing even more developments on this front that could breathe more life into a genre that I love very much. So there you guys go, a video that I wanted to share. I know it's not exactly the most exciting subject in the world, but it's something I personally find very interesting and I wanted to talk about today. So I definitely appreciate it if you listen to this whole thing. I hope you found it as interesting as I do, and if you're a member of my regular audience or you love CRPGs, I think you just might have. So again, thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.